Oregon. I'm catching you in Oregon, right?
Yeah, this is my fortress of solitude. So out there is literally the wilderness.
It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Ben Santer, an atmospheric scientist formerly of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Livermore, California, where his research focused on such topics as climate model evaluation, use of statistical methods in climate science, and identification of natural and anthropogenic fingerprints in the observed climate records. Furthermore, Dr. Santer served as the convening lead author of the Climate Change Detection and Attribution chapter of the 1995 IPCC report, where his research on the climatic effects of combined changes in greenhouse gases and sulfate aerosols contributed to the historic, quote-unquote, discernible human influence conclusion of the 1995 report by the IPCC. His awards include the MacArthur Fellowship Award, commonly nicknamed the Genius Award, the U.S. Department of Energy's E.O. Lawrence Award, as well as Distinguished Scientist Fellowships from the U.S. Department of Energy and the Office of Biological and Environmental Research. Dr. Santer was also featured in the 2014 documentary Merchants of Doubt, a movie based off a book of the same name originally published in 2010. Today, Dr. Santer and I discuss his experience, as well as the impacts of climate change on public health. Thanks for joining me today. I certainly appreciate your time. I know that you just got back from a couple weeks on the East Coast. Now, you retired, what, 3 years ago?
I retired in 2021.
From the Lawrence Livermore Lab?
Yep, from almost 30 years at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I nearly made 30 years. I was 3 or 4 months shy, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And what was your role there for 30 years? Did you have a specific title?
Yeah, I was actually a physicist, was my
Okay.
formal title. But in practice, I did atmospheric sciences. So my job was to use computer models of the climate system to try and understand natural and human effects on climate.
Mm-hmm. And so your educational background isn't physics. It is specifically in atmospheric sciences, but your title just happened to be physicist.
Yeah.
And retiring in 2021, you're up in Oregon now, but you're still very active in the scientific community. Like you had just mentioned, you were back east for a couple of weeks, still doing some work with some research institutes out there.
Yeah, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution kindly gave me a visiting scientist in residence position, and that allows me to spend 2 months each year at Woods Hole trying to promote fingerprinting in the ocean. So to use pattern recognition methods and apply them to stuff like ocean temperature, ocean salinity, ocean chlorophyll, a measure of ocean productivity, things like alkalinity, to understand how and why humans are impacting the ocean.
Mm-hmm. So when you say fingerprinting, I think of literally a fingerprint. Is it called that because that's what it is?
Well, if you think of a fingerprint, it's used in forensic science, and its use there is because no two humans have exactly the same pattern, the same fingerprint. There are characteristic features, whorls, ridges, double ridges, and using those features, I believe it was a guy called Bertillon in France over a century ago, found out that you could discriminate between different individuals. Same deal in climate science. There are multiple factors that affect Earth's climate. Changes in the sun, changes in volcanic activity, human-caused changes through burning fossil fuels in levels of heat-trapping greenhouse gases. And just like in fingerprints, there are different patterns, these whorls, ridges, all that nice stuff. None of these factors that influence Earth's climate, sun, volcanoes, greenhouse gases, has the same pattern in climate records. Each one of those things does different things geographically. If you look at slices through the Earth's atmosphere, So if you understand those pattern differences, those fingerprints of the sun, of volcanoes, of human caused changes in greenhouse gases, that gives you discriminatory power. You can disentangle in observations the impacts of the sun, volcanoes, and human factors. And that's what I do.
You mentioned the human influence, it kind of a nice little segue that I want, a kind of a jumping off point for us that I'd like to go back a little bit to, and that is going back to 1995 and the role that you played in the IPCC's symposium, specifically Chapter 8, the second argument, the role you played in that literature and the conclusion you came to.
Well, let's back up a minute. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They were established in 1988 by the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization. And the role of the IPCC was to advise the nations of the world about climate change, the physical climate system, likely impacts of humans on climate, um, impacts of climate change on stuff we care about, human health, agriculture, energy resources, and possible mitigation and adaptation strategies. So, ways that we might deal with the impacts of humans on climate and reduce those impacts. The IPCC has issued 6 reports since it was founded in 1988, and I was responsible for one chapter of the second assessment report.
Okay.
That report was published in 1995. And it turned out, in retrospect, that the chapter of the report in 1995 that I was responsible for was critical. That was the chapter that dealt with detection of climate change and attribution of causes. And after nearly 2 years of work, a group of several dozen scientists all around the world, experts in the field, concluded with these 12 words, quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate," unquote. And it was the first time that the international scientific community had said, we can see a human-caused global warming signal in records. This isn't natural. Humans have affected the global climate. That was a big deal. Unfortunately, a lot of very powerful individuals, companies, and even countries, think Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, didn't like that finding. It was bad for business.
Mm-hmm.
It said, we're affecting the climate. There's credible scientific evidence for that. And ultimately, that meant that humans might have to reduce emissions of heat trapping greenhouse gases that were causing the problem. So, after publication of the 1995 report, I spent 2 years of my life defending that finding, the process by which it had been reached, and explaining the nature of the scientific evidence that underpinned that discernible human influence finding.
Yeah, I'm guessing by the way those 12 words kind of rolled out of your mouth there that they've created some issue in the last 20 years for your life. There was some blowback from that study, not only professionally but perhaps a little personally as well.
Yeah, a lot of blowback, and I get it. There was no personal animus.
Mm-hmm.
It was just that, like it or not, I was the convening lead author of that chapter in which those 12 words were situated.
Right.
And the best way for some of these forces of unreason, as I like to call them, to discredit the discernible human influence finding was by going after me
Mm-hmm.
and arguing that I was a crappy scientist or that I had engaged in serious professional misconduct or that the discernible human influence finding was only based on my paper or that I was in collusion with powerful political forces. It was a tough time back
Mm-hmm.
then. It's remained tough since 1995. But what I learned was that there's no point in being a scientist if you're unwilling to defend the technical work that you
Sure.
do. I had to explain what we had learned as a community. That was part of my job. I couldn't shirk that responsibility. The
Hmm.
buck stopped here, and I took that lesson to heart. There are times in all of our lives where we have to declare who we are, what we've learned, what we consider to be important, where we can't just retreat to our offices, close the door, curl up into a fetal position, and hope that the bad stuff will go away.
Right.
It does.
I think a lot of people don't understand either that, you mentioned the IPCC. This isn't just a panel of soccer moms and dads that got together. I mean, if we were to use a sports analogy, this would be the all-stars of the community that came together or were either appointed or elected or had proven their worth by being cited, referenced, or publishing themselves, come together and come to a mutual decision. I also don't think a lot of people understand the scrutiny, the peer review that an article or an argument like this goes through in order to get to the point of publication.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. So if you submit a scientific paper, typically you have two, three reviewers, sometimes one or two more, that in the case of contentious research. Here in an IPCC report, you have expert review involving dozens of experts first. Then you have um, country review, which has multiple phases where anyone in any country that is part of the IPCC can submit comments on everything that you've written. You literally have thousands of comments that you have to deal with and have to respond to. Uh, it was the most rigorous peer review process that I've ever been a part of before or after 1995. And typically, it's what I would like to call lowest common denominator science. So, in order to keep everybody happy, uh, you're not making wild, outrageous claims
Mm-hmm.
that are speculative. You're
Right.
going with stuff that is really well established.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, back in 1995, the emerging science of fingerprinting in particular had showed that this isn't natural. What's happening on planet Earth in the atmosphere, in the oceans, is not explainable by natural causes alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm proud of the fact that that 1995 discernible human influence conclusion, although controversial at the time, has been affirmed and confirmed again and again and again by every subsequent scientific assessment report,
Mm-hmm.
not just by the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth assessment reports of the IPCC, but by assessments of the National Academy
Mm-hmm.
of Sciences, the national academies of many different countries. So that's the way science works. If
Mm-hmm.
you come out with an extraordinary claim, humans are affecting global climate, people are going to kick the tires and test that, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
And the bottom line is that that discernible human influence claim has withstood the test of time, and it's been strengthened rather than weakened. In the most recent IPCC report in 2021, rather than the cautious, wimpy, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on climate, the IPCC was much clearer. It is unequivocal, their word, that human fingerprints are in the atmosphere, the oceans, the land, they're everywhere.
And was there even some more solid follow up in 2019 with the gold paper that sort of alluded to or made reference all the way back to 1995?
Yeah, so in 2019, we wrote a paper that showed that we're now at 5 sigma. So in physics, 5 sigma is typically the gold standard, say, for particle discovery. For example, when physicists claimed 4 or 5 years ago to have discovered the so-called God particle, the
Mm-hmm.
Higgs
The
boson.
Higgs boson.
Um, the evidence they used in support of that claim was 5 sigma. So we made measurements, they said, that are 5 sigma beyond what we would expect to see if there were no such particle. And in climate science, as we showed in 2019, we're way beyond 5 sigma. And that was the point of that 2019 paper, to show credible evidence that um, we're we're now at 6, 7, 8 sigma. We're in realms where it's virtually impossible for any natural cause to explain what we've measured, monitored, and observed in Earth's climate system.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So we've gone from 1995 to 2019. You and I are speaking now in 2023, April 30th to be exact. And get very recent, last Wednesday on the 26th, there was I want to say a Senate Budget Committee meeting on the relationship between health and climate change. And I'm assuming you are familiar with a quote that I read when I was reading about that from the senator from Wisconsin. Um, believe his name is Ron Johnson. He's a Republican senator from Wisconsin. And I'm just going to kind of paraphrase that. He basically said that global warming will actually be beneficial because there'll be less mortality from cold. I mean, was that pretty much what was said at that meeting?
That's pretty much what Senator Johnson claimed at that meeting, that the net benefit of climate change for the state of Wisconsin would be positive.
The first word that comes to mind for me is just absurd. Like,
Yeah, it is absurd. Look at COVID. COVID taught us that we are embedded in a global society. And if that society is not thriving, you ain't going to be thriving. Climate change is exactly the same. Climate change is a global problem. It's affecting not only the far flung Arctic, small islands in the Pacific being imperiled by sea level rise, it affects all of us. It's in
Mhm.
our backyards. Extreme weather changes, changes in the frequency, intensity, duration of heat waves, drought, flooding, we see that all around the world. So the um, ignorance of saying, well, with warming, things are going to be a little bit better in my neck of the woods here, and I won't have to worry about the rest of the world. I won't have to worry about food supply. I won't have to worry about supply chains. I won't have to worry about smoke from forest fires in the West, which of course affected the Midwest last year and for several years now. None of this stuff matters to me because I'm going to be a little bit warmer and winters are going to be a little less severe. That's ignorant, A. And B, it's abdication of all senatorial responsibility to understand a problem that's going to affect every citizen in Mr. Johnson's state.
Yeah. Your vote matters. People who don't think that voting matters, your vote matters. These are your elected officials. So uh,
Yeah,
pay
you know,
attention, educate yourself, get out there and vote for the right people.
folks who incorrectly dismiss climate change as a hoax, a conspiracy, something of no particular concern to them, are failing their electorate, plain and simple.
Well, let me ask you on that subject, sort of maybe too personal of a question, but you just said hoax, denial. This is a subject and a work that you've dedicated your life to. You just said you spent 30 years down here in California. You're still continuing to do the work with other research institutions as you into your retirement. How does it hit you when you hear the terms hoax and denial? And I know that there's some history, certainly with politicians and scientists. I mean, Ted Cruz a few years ago went on late night and talked about how it was a hoax. How does that hit you when you hear those words about your life's work?
Well, imagine, if you will, that you devote your entire career to doing one thing to the best of your ability. In my case, that one thing was trying to understand the nature and causes of climate change. You wake up one morning, and a very powerful man, the new president of the United States, dismisses incorrectly everything you've done as a hoax and a conspiracy, and actually uses those words. Climate change is a hoax engineered by the Chinese in order to diminish American competitiveness. Your new boss at the Department of Energy refers to climate change as, quote, a contrived, phony mess. This is the former head of the Department of Energy, Rick Perry. What do you do with that stuff? You have to make some decision. One decision would be to hope the bad stuff goes away and say, I'm just going to hunker down, I'm going to hide, which was the instruction given to us at the beginning of the Trump presidency, not draw attention to myself, and hope that in 4 years' time things are different. No. To me, you have a societal responsibility to call it as it is, to explain that incorrect characterization of the science as a hoax and a conspiracy hurts all of us.
Hmm.
Ultimately, in the United States and around the world, we're going to have to take hard decisions on how to deal with climate change. My perspective is we got to take those decisions based on the best available scientific evidence, not on misinformation or disinformation. And that's what I've tried to do then, to counter mis and disinformation, particularly if it rises to the level of formal congressional testimony or statements from very, very powerful people, like the former president of the United States or the former secretary of the Department of Energy. You have a responsibility as a scientist to defend the technical work that you do, and I'm proud that I did that.
Hmm. Hmm. There are a lot of headline making subjects associated with climate change. I see on the news or I read and click on articles that talk about floods, droughts, forest fires. These things seem to get the attention. They get the clicks. They make the breaking news chyron on, CNN or MSNBC. But I'm curious about some of the consequences and outcomes of climate change that I don't think get enough attention, or other sort of consequences and outcomes that we're just not aware enough of yet. I was reading about 2 weeks ago that we should concern ourselves with the increased price of rice because rice is being affected. The ability to grow and cultivate it, crop yields are going to decrease dramatically, and it's a result of climate change. And so it just got me thinking about what other public health um, crises are associated with climate change that we don't pay enough attention to, such as food and water scarcity. You and I have spoken recently about the spread of diseases that are associated through certain insect vectors. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on that. Not only the food and water scarcity, but just the number of increasing infections. You had mentioned to me Lyme disease. Can you comment a little bit on that, about the Lyme disease in the Northeast?
Yeah, well, uh, the medical community, just before we get into Lyme disease, takes climate change seriously. They should. The most prestigious medical journals, think Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, many august and authoritative bodies, National Academy of Medicine in the United States, they get it. They understand that higher temperatures will affect humans around the planet. They get and are studying excess mortality associated with extreme heat, with drought. Uh, and they've issued a number of reports pointing to climate change as the most serious problem facing the medical community in the 21st century. All that stuff is real. Now, what are some components of that intersection between climate change and risk to human health? Um, high temperature, access to clean, fresh water, with, for example, melting of glaciers in the Himalayas, in the Andes. Um, there are issues related to food security that are very serious, which you mentioned. One consequence of human caused warming is global sea level rise, which we've measured and monitored. The projections are, even at the conservative end, that we're facing 1 to 2 feet of global mean sea level rise by the end of the 21st century. Rice production, a lot of it is at or close to sea level. You throw 1 to 2 feet of global mean sea level rise on top of existing areas of rice production, you have a serious problem. You start heating up the bread baskets where we grow wheat and corn, uh, you have a serious problem. All of these things demand urgent attention. As we saw during COVID, you disrupt food supply, you have serious, serious problems above and beyond the problem of the virus itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this stuff is real. It's happening now. We ignore it at our peril. Vector-borne diseases, many diseases like dengue fever, for example, Zika, Lyme disease, the vectors carrying the diseases have geographical ranges that are largely driven by temperature and moisture. You warm the planet, you moisten the atmosphere, you change rainfall patterns, you change the geographical ranges of these vector-borne diseases. Again, not science fiction, but something that we've seen playing out over the last century, in particular with Lyme disease. Tick-borne, with warming, the area affected by Lyme disease in the northeast of the United States has expanded dramatically because the ticks can live in different areas than they could previously. They're not
Mm-hmm.
as cold limited as they were previously. So, um, if I'm a doctor, and if I'm a real doctor, medical doctor, and looking at the projections of how temperature and moisture are going to change and how extreme heat is going to change, uh, I'm extremely concerned, because this is what I am going to have to deal with over the course of my career,
Mm-hmm.
which is why, comments like those from Senator Johnson are so concerning. Even in his state, folks are going to have to deal with the health consequences of global climate change.
Right. And one of the consequences is also just a migration, a displacement migration. So not only are we moving out of areas that are losing resources, but they're perhaps bringing us closer into contact to insects that are thriving in those areas that we are also trying to occupy at the same time.
Yeah, um, climate change will be the driver of human migration involving tens of millions of people. Arguably, it already is.
Mhm.
If you look at Central America, if you look at Syria, there are credible analyses that suggest that um, that conflicts happen because of access to water, because of access to food, and those are the drivers for human migration. Look at look at Africa. Um, Look at the fraction of the population that lives at or close to sea level. Lagos, a big city, 18 million people, right at sea
Right
level.
at sea level.
1 to 2 feet of global mean sea level rise are going to create political instability and migration that, again, we just can't ignore. This is coming. We have to understand it. We have to try and ameliorate climate change and its impacts. Um, Incorrectly dismissing all of this stuff as a hoax, or I'm going to be all right in Wisconsin,
Hmm.
does a disservice to hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who will be affected by climate change.
Do we take into consideration the mental health, the stress and anxiety that comes along from a migration such as that? And therefore, do we take into consideration the stress and anxiety and mental health that is associated with climate change?
I think there are folks out there in the medical community who are paying more attention to mental health. Um, I'm frequently asked in public lectures, is it okay to have kids, given what we understand about climate change? Uh, there are women who are seriously concerned about bringing kids into this world, a world where the children are going to have to grow up in very, very serious conditions where there is rapid environmental change, sea level rise, changes in extreme events. Is it ethically and morally responsible to have kids? And those kind of concerns, of course, generate serious mental health issues for folks. There are concerns about loss of homeland, like in small island states in the Pacific, loss of identity, loss of culture, loss of everything you know. Uh, in in Alaska, we see those as well with native communities up there that are being forced today to relocate because of loss of sea ice and the pounding of the coastline. Then, when you lose that sea ice buffer by storms, by rising sea level, by thawing of permafrost, what does that mean for your mental health if you lose your cultural identity? Again, these are not academic questions in some time far into the future. These are questions of mental health that communities around the world are dealing with now. Salmon being another. You and I spoke about it a little
Hmm.
while ago. With salmon fisheries collapsing or changing dramatically, in part because of migration patterns that are fueled by warming oceans. What does that mean for your identity uh, if something you've relied on and is part of your cultural heritage is suddenly fundamentally different?
Hmm.